Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 7, Episode 4. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
In this episode, we're back live on the mic for one of our popular solo episodes, exploring the implications of one of my favorite and powerful phrases, the escalating commitment to a losing course of action.
Well, I love to say failing course of action, but I think what we know about this statement is that there's lots of versions of it. So I was actually trying to come up with the origins of it, and it's a little bit hazy, but it does get repeated every once in a while. So listeners will have to stay tuned to hear exactly what we're talking about it in the retail context.
And speaking of an escalating commitment, though, of course, not a losing course of action or a failing course of action, special thanks to our partners, Aaron and the folks at Advantage, for sponsoring our pop-up beachside podcasting studio at Mandalay Bay, coming up at the Grocery Shop Conference mid-September in Las Vegas.
Yeah, given that we've done this before back at Shop Talk, it's definitely not a failing course of action. We had a lot of fun with it. We had some amazing guests on the mic back in the spring, and we're going to have the same. And if folks are interested in a remote podcast studio opportunity at future events like the NRF coming up in January, just let us know. You can send an email to podcast@sageberryconsulting.com.
All right, let's get right into the news. Earnings. We've been off the mic live in terms of talking about what's going on, so we've got a bit of catching up to do. Lots of earnings came out. Lots of not so great earnings. Take us through it.
Yeah, well, given that we have we took a week off, or not a week off completely because we had an encore episode, but we haven't done the earnings. There's really too many to go through. We're pretty much through the earnings season now. But what I would say, big picture, pretty tepid results for the most part, and a lot of retailers from Dick's Sporting Goods, Lowe's, Gap, a lot of the department store folks, Foot Locker, Victoria's Secret, Peloton, you name it, pretty much pointed to a weak outlook. In a lot of cases, citing macroeconomic factors like high interest rates, persistent inflation, this U.S. Student loan repayment thing getting started up in a few weeks. We're even
it's a bit of a headwind, right? It's a generic headwind for everybody. Yeah.
Macy's and a couple others called out that they were starting to see rising credit delinquencies. So that's a little scary. Of course, a bunch of folks also, Dick's most notably, made a big deal about increasing shrinkage. And that seems to be a pretty persistent theme.
All right, that goes without comment, but I had to throw that in.
Well, I will just say I was at a conference where there was somebody from a big industry group that pointed out that for the most part, they were not seeing nearly the degree of shrinkage increases that some retailers are pointing to. And I've had a similar experience with some of my clients, but clearly some retailers are reporting greater increases. So it's unclear, most shrinkage is actually related to employee theft or inventory systems issues. So there's part of me that thinks it's a little bit of a smokescreen. There's part of me that thinks that as people cut back on expenses, on undersoft business, less staffing is creating opportunities, or as they're not treating their employees so well, maybe there's a little bit of revenge kind of stuff going on. So I think it's a complicated topic.
I saw Matt Shea on the business news talking about it, Matt Shea from the NRF, and he was, he had two things to talk about, and one of them was theft, and he was talking about what was Prop 47 in California. They've kind of thrown the blame a little bit on the state legislation that he said, listen, we have people coming back because there are some pretty notable big thefts happening.
Sure, absolutely,
that make the news, right? So it's a good question, is because we see these outrageous acts from gangs that go in and steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. But is that how systematic is that? We see pictures, everybody posts them of, Dove shampoo being locked up behind, glass. So it is a little hard to get a read of it. But it's, if it's on Matt's mind and he's on the news talking about it, it's got to be something, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's real. I think it might be a little bit overblown, and it might be a little bit of self-inflicted wounds, but it's clearly a hot topic. Now, to be on the positive side, there were a few outliers among the earnings reports. Lululemon continues to just keep rocking along. Sales up 18%. They raised their guidance. Now, some of that is they are getting a bounce back in China, which had been weak for them. Ulta, we recently reprised the Dave Kimball episode. Great growth, also raised their guidance. Abercrombie and Fitch, we've seen a lot of weakness among apparel players, and yet A&F was able to put together a good quarter. So I think it's really, some of the performance, like with Lowe's, has to do with the economic headwinds in their category.
Right.
But there are plenty of folks that seem to be defying that narrative.
And if you think of Lululemon, it's not like they don't have very sharp competitors now. You think of our and
Sure.
we reprised the episode with Joe Kula from Viore, very strong competitor. Yet they continue to rack up 18% gains. That's pretty impressive, right?
Yeah.
Now we've also got, which has kind of been absent for a while, some IPO fever going on with some pretty notable brands making the noise that they're going to do IPOs. Talk about that for a bit.
Well, the one that was in the news this past week and got a fair amount of attention is Instacart, which is not a retailer per se. A lot of interesting tidbits in their S1. The main one I thought was that 30% of their revenues come from advertising.
Yeah,
and if you approach it with some pretty conservative estimates of what their profitability in the ad business might be, basically more than 100% of their profits come from advertising. So this is starting to look like there's lots of businesses which seem like they might be retail businesses or delivery businesses, but that's kind of the loss leader, for being a media business. But we'll see how many of these, I think next up in terms of big retailers or well-known brands is Birkenstock, but we've also got Fabletics, Fanatics, Impossible Foods, Liquid Death, maybe Saks.com, maybe Shein, Klaviyo in the tech space, all coming to market. So it could be a pretty busy fall.
Madison Read takes a bit of the D out of DTC. I think they're already distributed a little bit in Ulta, but they cut a big deal with Walmart. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't know how much Madison Read is on people's radar screen, but they're one of the more established digitally native vertical brands or original digitally native vertical brands. They've been opening quite a lot of stores. I think they're probably up to close to 100 by now, which probably puts them second or third behind Warby Parker in terms of DNVBs that have opened their own stores.
And they are hair coloring, right?
Hair coloring, right?
Right.
And I think we're talking about opening quite a lot more stores. And it now seems like they may be doing what we're seeing with a number of these brands is starting to think about, maybe wholesale's not so bad. So you're right, a little bit of distribution in Ulta. But last week they announced a big deal with Walmart where they'll be selling apparently to something like 1,500 Walmart stores as well as Walmart.com. So again, I think this underscores some things we've talked about multiple times, but I think it also maybe underscores that the incremental economics of opening your own stores beyond, 50, 100, 150 might not be so great. So it might be a little bit of a, indicator of some things to come from some other of these DNVB brands that said they were going to be all about physical retail.
So big hot news last week with Shein reaching an agreement with Forever 21, both retailers distributing each other's products online and in store. So, sending more products to landfill in new and novel ways, I guess. But what's your take?
Yeah, well, I'm always, I think like you, of very much mixed emotions when we talk about some of these fast fashion brands. But this is, I think, if you put that aside, if you just set your ethics aside completely. Yeah, that's right. This, I think, is a pretty interesting deal for both brands. So the essence of the deal, as I understand it, is that Forever 21 will be able to sell their products on Shein's e-commerce site, and then Shein will be testing some sales of their products in Forever 21 stores, which is quite a few locations. And of course, as we've talked about many times, it's very difficult to be profitable in fashion apparel given the mailing costs and high rates of returns and things like that. So this could be pretty interesting economically. Then there's also some kind of side deals to it where Shein is going to take a 1/3 stake in Forever 21's parent company, the Spark Group, which is involved with a bunch of other brands in partnership with Simon Property and Authentic Brands Group. And then Spark, in turn, will take a minority stake in Shein, which, as we just mentioned, looks like a maybe going public in a few months' time. So interesting tie up. But yeah, don't love the rapid growth of some of these disposable fashion brands.
Yeah, I mean, two quick comments. When Shein does do pop-ups, retail pop-ups, they've done them here and in Canada and the US, they are madly attended. So there seems to be no compunction about from their audience about shopping from them in physical retail. So as you say, setting ethics aside, looks like a pretty good deal. And it'll be interesting to watch Shein in the IPO world, because the US legislators have tattooed them and say, listen, man, you got to prove that you're on the right side of evil here before we let you do an IPO. So that'll be interesting to watch, whether that kind of they're able to prove all the things or disprove all the things that the Congress seems to think of them at. So we'll keep a close eye on that anyway. It's just kind of a sideshow on the IPO network. Instacart's the really interesting one. Let's talk about the next thing. This growing return to work pressure reminded me of a line from a favorite Tragically Hip song of mine. The appearance of conflict meets the appearance of force. So talk about what you think about this. I want you back in the office kind of clamoring.
Well, yeah. It's been building, I think, where we've seen it the most this summer. And I think it's actually going to be pretty interesting once we get post-Labor Day, because I get the sense, largely anecdotally, that some firms basically said, okay, the summer's sort of more laid back. We'll revisit this once we're back post-Labor Day. But most, I think we've seen it in very traditional companies, investment banks, law firms, things like that. The particular reason why I flagged it this week is largely because of Amazon's pressure. Andy Jassy, their CEO, was pretty clear that more or less, if you don't get back to work, you're probably not going to have a job, which is pretty heavy.
3 days a week.
Right. Yeah.
3
and
days
of course,
not 5. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it varies, I think. But so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because I think we're definitely seeing more companies start to put pressure and threats in some cases on employees.
Yeah.
And, we're seeing kind of a mixed picture in terms of what the effect on productivity really is from a research standpoint. I definitely think some of it is this kind of productivity paranoia.
Yes.
But some of it, may be substantive. But I think from a retail perspective, not only is it interesting in terms of how it affects individual retailers or retail tech companies or what have you, but as we've talked about, if we really start to see this take hold, it does have a positive impact on urban areas generally, and a positive impact on retailers that are located in those areas in the commercial real estate market more broadly. I'm just a little bit I think we'll see a move back. Yeah. I'm not so sure how dramatic it will be anytime soon, but definitely seeing things ratchet up.
Yeah, a couple of quick comments. One is it's interesting timing, because I don't know about you, but we're seeing more COVID cases, right? So COVID seems to be making a bit of a return in the fall. So there's already some conversation about that. So that, of course, plays against come back to work. And there's a great article in the New York Times that kind of looks at all the B property that's sitting empty in Manhattan. And it's hard to imagine this old B property. And there's something like the equivalent of almost 30 empty Empire State Buildings vacant, not just underused, but vacant.
Right. So, no, it's quite dramatic in some cities.
I do worry about, A, the impact on the economy, but B, I also think that, when I talk to retailers, they're like, I'm paying a lot of money now for my office where there's almost nobody in it. But when the lease comes up, I'm going to shrink and I'm going to save a lot of money. All right. Well, listen, great wrap. That's a wrap on the news for the week, or a week and a half or 2 weeks. Let's get to our main episode, Escalating Commitment to a Failing Course of Action. So one of my favorite terms, I studied this, or I had a great course, shout out to a professor of mine, Glenn White, who introduced this concept to me. But not everyone may know what the concept means in the fullness, and what got you thinking about this in the context of retail.
Well, a couple things. I think the thing that prompted me, just in terms of this exact timing, was when we saw some of the department store results. So Macy's, Kohl's, Dillard's, regional player here in the States. And some people were commenting as if their problems were more short term. It's flight to value, or people are traveling more, and that's why they're not spending in department stores. And you could even say the same thing about the Gap,
sure,
Victoria's Secret, Foot Locker. I mean, a number of these brands that have been around for a while having disappointing results. And my reaction was, well, it's been a pretty tough 20 years for them. This is not a short-term phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, the flip side, and I know we talked about this, you do see brands like Ulta that are doing great. You see fantastic results from most of the off-price retailers. So we're not even talking about e-commerce, just even mostly physical stores. And when you look at it, the reality is these trends have been pretty much in place minimally 10 years, but in many cases more than 20. And yet the players, like some I just mentioned, continue to do basically the same thing they've been doing for a long time. The particular thing was last week, Penney, right, who is on their fourth CEO in 10 years, announced a new plan. They're going to spend $1 billion. Yeah. The plan looks almost exactly like the plan I presented to the board at Sears in 2002. Yeah. A little stronger on the e-commerce side, but not much. And the question is, why do people keep escalating their commitment to something that appears quite objectively to not only not be working in the last few months, but in many cases for a decade or more? But also, this new book, which I keep teasing, and there'll be a lot more information, I promise, in the next few weeks, is also deals with this issue, is why do so many transformations fail? What is it that keeps companies over a long period of time from taking the actions that they must? So in a nutshell, that's kind of the longer term and then the very, very newsworthy reasons to take it on.
Let's unpack the concept a little bit. I don't know if you want to say academically, but when I learned of it, it was the clearest example to me. One of the clearest examples was a bank loan, right? You the bank says, here's your $1 million. You say, listen, I can't make the payment, but give me another 100,000 and I'll make that payment. And then, I can't make that payment. Give me another bridge loan to make that payment. And at some point it becomes very clear you're just never going to catch up. That was one of the things that I learned. Now, how do you think of it, and what theories are these kind of based on, both psychological and practical, that would help the listener understand the fullness of this concept?
Well, my understanding, and I'm not sure when I first learned about it, I actually think I may have heard it in the interview with Daniel Pink that you did, but maybe I heard it before that. But in any event, from what I understand, there's the psychological side of it, which is something called prospect theory, which is just a human tendency, once we've committed to something, to keep going. We've made that decision, and at the time we thought it was a good decision, and even though we're seeing negative outcomes, we're just going to keep doubling down, essentially, on a losing hand. But I think there's also this idea, so that's kind of a commitment bias is another term for that. In economics, I think the other way that some people may be familiar with it is this sunk cost fallacy. That you've spent money, and because you've spent money, it makes sense for you to try to get it back. But actually, going forward, it doesn't make any sense. You can't get back sunk costs. So I think it's a psychological thing, and I think also it's probably exacerbated by the degree of commitment we've made and not recognizing that sunk costs are sunk and that opportunity costs are real. Well,
the concept is not new. Your take on it is interesting because it's built on a career of trying to understand and execute transformation. So what is it that you think that is so compelling today that has brought us to this point where there's so many examples? Like, it's not a random example of one. There's many, many examples of where we're seeing this kind of this phenomenon at play. Talk about that for a bit.
Well, I'm not sure exactly why we're seeing so much of it. It's a little bit like the proverbial frog boiling in water, maybe, is that some of these brands, again, whether we're talking about the Macy's or the Gaps or even to a certain extent, stronger brands like Nordstrom, or I have quite a lot of experience with Neiman Marcus, which was in the news the past week because of a rumored merger with Saks Fifth Avenue. And I went back and looked at some of Neiman's statistics. Their business is considerably smaller than it was when I left. And I think for some, there's some interesting things in Neiman's history in terms of a ill-advised PE buyout and so forth. But in terms of the ability to retain customers that they needed to, but more importantly, grow and win new customers, I think I haven't seen any internal data in like 15 years, but I think objectively they've done a terrible job. And it's, having worked there, I know, I understand some of the reasons why. And yet with compelling information, not very much has been done. And some of this, I think, relates to, and I would really recommend this book for people if they haven't checked it out, Clay Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma from 1997. So it's a pre-digital book, and I've been working on my book to try to make it, kind of update some of those concepts. But it's really it's just the bias against competing with yourself. You've got this big established, let's say in the case of Neiman's or Nordstrom's or Macy's, this installed base of department stores, mostly in malls. And the tendency, I think, is to protect them rather than actively compete with yourself. So what Christensen points out fundamentally, there's a lot of other good ideas in the book, is that there's this tendency to protect the core while either smaller players or new players are able to pick off your vulnerabilities. So I think if we look at retail broadly, again, even aside from e-commerce, I actually think in some cases the problems are not so much about e-commerce because nothing prevents any of these brands that were department store based and largely physical from having compelling e-commerce presences. In many cases they do. At Neiman's, we had a great e-commerce penetration. Nordstrom has a very high e-commerce penetration. The issue are the more fundamentally stronger brands that steal a lot of share away from you. And if you look at the share of department stores, just as one example, and there's some different numbers, but they more or less peaked in about 2020 or 2002-ish. Some different numbers. Sometimes it looks like 1999. Sometimes it looks like 2003. But the trend has been downward ever since, going from something, again, depending on what classification or definition you like, somewhere from like 8% of all retail to like 2%. Yeah. So this has been going on, and share has leaked largely to the off-price category and to players like Ulta and to a certain degree to discount merchants. So the facts are overwhelming.
I mean, it's funny as I'm listening to you because it's basically to understand what's happened. Just have a listen to the last 7 seasons of the Remarkable Retail Podcast while you're reading your book, because many of the concepts or the ideas that you highlight have led us to this point, which is often I get, how did we get here and why is this the case? I mean, it's the need to be remarkable, the collapse of the middle, the need to get out of the middle and pick a lane, like on and on. It's really have a listen to what we've been talking about. It really gets us to where we are today.
It does. And I guess the thing I probably should have said this at the outset, because there's a point at which now, and I think I've said this probably on the podcast at least once or twice, I often get asked by people, whether it's in the press or clients or what have you, okay, if you were in charge of Penney's right now, you were in charge of Kohl's right now, what would you do? And my answer is, I believe it's too late. And so my message is, don't, along this 20-year trajectory of lost market share, where if you did any kind of market research at all, it would be clear where share in various categories was leaking to. I say this because I did this work at Sears. And when you do the work, it's really clear. The question is, can or will you do anything about it? I've talked to the head of consumer insights at Penney 15, 16, 17 years ago, and their data, was very, very compelling in terms of where, and I'm not going to share too much about it, but it's pretty clear where it was going and why. If the answer, which is part of the answer, is it's going to more value-oriented and convenience-oriented retailers, basically off-the-mall players like the off-price guys, then what do you have to do in your current format to negate that? And the problem is it's very hard to work out what you could do that would change what are some fundamental shopping dynamics. Because one thing that's clear is, at least in the physical realm, is that convenience has been redefined. If you go back to the 90s, you didn't have nearly the degree of, so-called category killers. You didn't have nearly the number of discount mass merchants and all the specialty players and all the off-price guys. So this is a radical shift in how retail operates. And if you don't address that in your distribution strategy, you're going to fight an uphill battle. And there's no more greater evidence than what's happened, right? But yet, Macy's is now, for example, starting to get off the mall, but it's 15 years too late. They can't possibly build enough stores, first of all. But secondly, what's their edge over, what's going to get them to win back customers who have, rejiggered their loyalties over, again, almost 20 years. So that's the challenge. So the message, I think, is understand what's going on before you get to the point of no return. Like I don't have a lot of helpful advice for Macy's in particular, because they missed the boat.
Well, short of building a time machine to take them back in the past, I know you've been thinking deeply about this because you've got a new book coming out. So maybe it's time a little bit to share some of your latest thinking and a little bit about the book. So all of this is built to something, and I know a bit about the book, of course, and it's a much broader idea. But take us through a little bit of what you want to share at this kind of early stage.
Well, I'm gonna still tease a little bit, but fundamentally, the question I've been taking on first and foremost is why so many transformations fail, and I believe fundamentally the answer is that they're too timid. They don't change profoundly enough. Good example, department stores. And they don't do it quickly enough. Great example, the department stores. So if customers are demanding more and more, and if there are enough competitors that are delivering it, and customers are changing very quickly, competitors are deploying business models that are superior more quickly than you're changing as the kind of incumbent retailer, to use the Clayton Christensen language, then over time, this transformation gap is going to form. So, you've got to be able to respond at what I call the speed of disruption. And, again, I'm not to sort of pile on here, but what we've seen is that too many of these brands that are really struggling and have been struggling for years are really built for an era that no longer exists. They've basically been sleepwalking through this massive revolution. So, then the second question is, okay, well, if that's true, how do you understand where you are in this, and how do you start to prioritize things? But the other question I'm addressing is really kind of the heart of the book. Is it's not just about a better innovation process or partnering with VC firms or setting up an innovation lab. I think, those all could be valuable things to do.
Yeah, sure.
But those have been out there for a while. And the other
not new tactics. They're not new tactics.
And the question is, if this has been out there for a while, if most companies talk about the need to transform, some of it at a chief transformation officer, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Why do so many companies report that their transformation plans aren't working? And to me, part of the reason is really kind of a leadership mindset, or some of the things we do as leaders beyond just really understanding that transformation is important. And to me, one way of looking at it, and I go into more detail in the book, which I'm sure we'll talk about further down the road, is kind of this interaction between ego, ignorance, and fear. And what I mean by that is, I think, if you come in as, say, the new leader at JCPenney, or, really pick any CEO that's taken over a broken retailer in the last few years, I think there's often this belief that what made me successful in the past is likely to make me successful in the future. But there's also just the reality of the hand you're dealt. And, unfortunately, this is why some of my advice is not super helpful to the companies that are struggling. It's, there's no way Macy's is going to convince their board and their investors that they should blow up much of what they're doing and and take on an aggressive capital strategy. Like, there's just no way they're going to fund it. It's too risky at this point. They could have done it more incrementally if they started a while ago, but where they are now, they're just kind of boxed in. But I do think that
it's probably hard for somebody like, Mark Rosen, for example, JCPenney, to walk in and go, well, you're pretty much effed, so I'm not really quite sure,
Right.
what
you tend not
you
to
could
do well
do.
with it. Yeah. Well, you tend not to do well in the job interview if you take that, which is, one of the reasons why I don't work at any of those retailers.
Well, I'm sure it's not the conversation that was had at the Gap, for example, right? Hey, let's get some new blood, new thinking in, and are they going to be able to do what needs to be done with somebody out of the, it could be a wonderful leader. I mean,
right. Well, you're just in a better.
I don't know.
Yeah, at the risk of stating the obvious, which is really sad to me, is it's just unfortunately the way public companies work and the sort of investors that are attracted to certain type of more value-oriented investments. They're not looking for a shoot for the moon strategy from Foot Locker or Payless shoe stores or something like that. So even if you could look at the data and say, this is a slow slide into oblivion if you don't do something radical, which is, I think, for the most part, what the data shows in probably at least 9 out of 10 cases.
Now,
it's just not realistic.
I want to hang on that for a second. Something radical was once tried at JCPenney by a prior leader. But was it ill thought out? Because it was notable in the business lore as a complete failure. It was pretty radical for them, right? They were going to go to everyday pricing, but it just didn't work. So they didn't do the work.
Ron Johnson, well, there's a couple things there. Ron Johnson was fundamentally right, and it kind of gets to, I talked about ego, ignorance, and fear. It's actually a good example. I think, Ron's ego was in overdrive because he alienated a lot of people, kind of I alone.
Apple, right? I created Apple retail.
I alone can fix this. Did not invite people in. Wasn't very vulnerable about what he knew and what he didn't know. He knows a lot of things, but he didn't know very much about this sort of business. So I think that's an ego defect in Ron's case. And I also think it's a little bit of ignorance in terms of really understanding. You have to do the work and embrace the reality that you're starting with, and the reality that JCPenney is starting with, which I can say confidently, both because I know a bunch of people at Penney's, and it was pretty similar to my time at Sears, was you had a lot of customers in your customer base that contributed a lot to cash flow, but weren't really the customers that were going to get you to where you needed to. So as soon as he stopped pretty much cold turkey the promotional plan, and he took out of the assortment some of the most profitable pieces of the assortment, he basically was going to run a 30 or 40% hit to sales and an even bigger hit to margin. And that was just going to make the transformation dead in the water. So that was a desirable direction to move, but that needed to be a 3 to 5 year process. So you have to be careful not to just go too far too fast. But I do think that, in terms of this third thing of ego, ignorance, and fear, I think he was right. In fact, I use a term I've used before. I'm repeating it in my new book, this idea that the opposite is risky. In other words, a lot of people will really just don't understand risk appropriately. So, Macy's could have decided to get off the mall more aggressively 20 years ago, but they didn't want to risk their core department store business. So their inaction has led to, 5, 6, 7, 8% sales decreçes for 2 decades. So
inaction is riskier. And
inaction is riskier, right. But you have to find the right, one of the things I say about executing or overcoming the trap of a timid transformation is that you have to figure out the right place to be on risk. And you have to test your way, in many cases, into it. So it's not a matter of going, oh, my God, everything we have is broken. We're only going to do this totally new thing that's unproven, which was closer to what Ron ended up doing. But he was absolutely right that without significant change at Penney's over a period of time, they were going to be out of business. And so when he was pushed by, I think Susie Welch was interviewing him for the Harvard Business Review, and he was laying out his plans, and she said, well, isn't that incredibly risky? He said, well, actually the opposite is risky. It's just that what he went too far too fast and didn't bring the team along with him. So I think it's true that a lot of the direction he was pointed in was right. But I would say one thing he did get wrong is you just can't keep doubling down your investment in big box department stores in regional malls. Like that's to me an obviously failed strategy.
The escalating commitment to a failed course of action. Now let's just talk about the book for one more second. Who are you writing this book for? Talk about that for a bit. Like when you sit down, pen and paper or keys on typewriter, who do you think should be reading your book?
Well, I really think about it as two fundamental audiences, because I should say that it's not a retail book. It is a leadership book. So hopefully the issues I point out and the prescriptions I provide really apply to one of two groups. One is folks that are in the midst of a transformation, but it's clearly not working. It's not gaining the traction they need or expect or want. The other are those that are nervous about the future. One of the quotes I have right in the beginning of the book is from Miles Davis, that noted business strategist, Miles Davis, who says, if you're not nervous, you're not paying attention. And I do think that, and I talked to some companies about this, that might be doing okay, but know that they are not moving fast enough, transforming profoundly enough to keep pace. Because I think it's pretty clear with things like generative AI, but plenty of other things we've seen over the past 2 decades, that a lot is changing. And, whether it's new competitors or consumer behaviors or impact of technology. So it's sort of for the nervous leader, I guess, at all sorts of companies.
And what's the timing? Talk about that. When we're talking about, where are we here? We're in the fall of 2023. When would folks expect to see the book on the shelves and get it in their hot hands?
Not ready to release the official release date and name and all that kind of stuff because we are still finishing up some stuff. But we'll have more to talk about in a few weeks, but early next year.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we'll be touching base as we go through on our various episodes. Well, great episode. I mean, I love the term, I love the phrase, and I love the concept. And boy, it was, as you say, front of mind. We talked about this episode when I read the JC Penney news. I'm like, you can't make this stuff up. Like the headlines really lead right into what we wanted to talk about. So listen, great episode. Let's leave it there. And a reminder to everybody that we're on our way to Vegas, and we'll be in the Vantage podcasting studio. And Vantage, of course, talks about retail media networks. So, really we're seeing a critical mass of interest. We talked about that on Instacart. So looking forward to that, and be sure and pop in and see us, and looking forward to see all our friends and having some great interviews. So see you very soon. We got an episode between then and now, but that's it for this episode. If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform so you can catch up with all our great episodes, including our recent interview with Carrie Baker, President, Canada Goose. And be sure to drop us that 5-star review where you listen to your podcast. It really helps us spread the word.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategy and innovation consultant, keynote speaker, and author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me at stephenpdennis.com, and be sure to follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and producer and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.